So sticking on similar lines for our Culture Roar this afternoon, I want to discuss if we should have self-identification laws in the UK. The Scottish Government has already tabled legislation at Holyrood to make it easier for people to change their legally recognised gender. Here to discuss this, I'm joined by Brendan O'Neill, the Chief Political Writer at Spiked, and Katy John Went, who's a non-binary transgender person and a diversity and inclusion facilitator, and Peter Tatchell, LGBTQ activist and director of the Peter Tatchell Foundation. Brendan, can I start with you, please? I'm going to give you 30 seconds to just make the case of why we shouldn't have self-identification laws.
Because we have to adhere to reality, to biological reality, to social reality, which is that there are some people who are male and there are some people who are female. I believe in sexual equality. Women should do whatever they want, but there is a difference between the sexes. You cannot change sex, and there are some circumstances in which women want their own spaces and deserve to have their own spaces. And in that situation, it makes no sense at all that we would allow men to claim to be women.
Katy John Went, as a non-binary transgender person, should we actually have self-ID laws? Do you think that would have made your life a lot easier?
Well, I think absolutely on this case, it's a yes and no answer, which is typically non-binary of me, I guess. It's the dilemma that we have is that we've always had self-ID. And the idea that this is the current problem is because we've made it a legal issue and because we have a polarized situation in society where people have become once more kind of afraid of the bogeyman, literally, and there's this kind of moral panic about trans people. But we've had trans people for centuries who have always self-ID'd in many respects before we ever had the options to transition surgically or hormonally. It's actually the very nature of us having had those opportunities since the 1930s and all the way up to now to increasingly allow people the possibility of changing their bodies has created some of the newer issues. But prior to that, people had always done it. And people self-ID as it is to go into toilets. I mean, I was in Liverpool Street Station just yesterday and joining the queue of women to use the women's loos. And there were 3 men in there. But they were all wearing orange jumpsuits and were doing cleaning, and they were self-IDing as cleaners. And most people could tell in that sense who they were and what they were doing in there. But people are self-ID'd and people check each other's appearances all the time, but they also most of the time just assume you're in there doing what you're meant to be doing. And self-ID is another way of saying passing in many respects, because what we're actually doing is policing people on passing. And there are more women who are challenged in women's spaces than trans are challenged in women's spaces because we're such a small proportion of the population.
Peter, can I just put that question to you then? Are you worried about there seems to be a new trend of, and I think we're going to see this, in my opinion, we're going to see this more and more, a trend of detransitioning, where people who have made generally irreversible changes to their body or been placed on these hormone treatments that I mentioned earlier, they're actually saying, I think I've made a horrible error here. Are you not worried about that trend?
Well, first, let me say what we are witnessing is a witch hunt against trans people. It is a shameful, disgusting, anti-human rights agenda, which no one would ever get away with if they were targeting Muslims, gay people, or Jews, or anybody else. It is absolutely disgraceful that the way in which the whole issue is being inflamed without any concern for the welfare or well-being of trans people. And all the issues that you have raised about trans people were very similar to the issues raised against gay people in the 1970s and 1980s, when people argued against gay equality. It was the same kind of demonization. The underlying principle of this argument is that trans women are predators, that they are a threat to biological women. There is almost no evidence of that, and in the small number of cases where it has happened, that is unrepresentative, and you do not make law based on what a few bad apples do. The majority of trans women treat other women with total respect. They pass, no one even knows that they're trans. And I think, to suggest they are a threat to other women is disproven by a friend of mine who works in a women's centre in the north of England. She has said that their centre has accepted trans women for 6 years with the agreement of the staff and the women users. There
Right,
has never
okay,
been a
so
problem.
Brendan, you're basically arguing you and J.K. Rowling here are just behind the times. You need to get with the equality agenda and actually advance gender recognition and allow trans men and women to be recognised in wider society as they want to be.
Well, Peter's right that there is a witch hunt, but it's not against trans people. It's against women who want to defend women's rights. And Nicola Sturgeon, as you said earlier, apologised for historical witch hunts last week. She should apologise for contemporary witch hunts, which are particularly bad in Scotland, where any woman who raises questions about the transgender agenda is instantly denounced as a TERF, which is a modern version of the word witch. She sometimes might lose her job. She'll be subjected to the most vile misogynistic abuse online, to rape threats, to death threats. All of this has happened to J.K. Rowling and other women too, simply for the crime of talking about womanhood and women's rights. That is despicable. And anyone who sides with that kind of abuse should be ashamed of themselves. And we have to have freedom in this discussion, the right of women to dissent from the new woke agenda, and the right of them to organise themselves as they see fit. That's the real equality agenda here, not the right of men to go into women's spaces.
I just want to put to all of you an NHS report that found that the Tavistock Gender Clinic isn't safe for children. This is England's only specialist service for young people who identify as transgender. Katy, were you concerned by the findings of NHS England here?
Well, I think all of these things need to be continually reviewed. One of the main issues with Tavistock is it's the only place where things are provided, and there is a major bottleneck there. But it's a complete myth that people walk in the door of the Tavistock and get puberty blockers and surgical transitions at a young age. They don't. You can't get surgical transition before 18. You typically don't get puberty blockers before Tanner stage 2 or 3. In your early teens or mid-teens, there's no such thing as going in at age 3 and getting all of this stuff before the age of 9 or anything like that. So there is a lot of myth being peddled out around this.
Right, but
just
Peter,
to say something,
Peter, do you believe that 3 sessions, there are some kids who've been through the Tavistock Clinic, 3 sessions and then placed on further treatment? Do you really think that 3 sessions with someone is enough to determine, frankly, whether or not you want to make generally irreversible changes to your body?
I cannot say whether that's true or not. The trans people I know have had to wait years to get any kind of treatment. Years and years, and have to go through hoops and hurdles, reviews, all kinds of interrogations about their lives. What you're saying is just not typical at all. The other thing I'd say is that there are several countries that have had self-ID for several years. None of them have had the problems that you and Brendan seem to think.
Right.
Plus,
so
on top of
do you
that,
want to just really quickly come back to that?
Well, I think the problem is the atmosphere that surrounds this discussion. It is incredibly intolerant, and it is vicious, and it is sometimes violent. The language is incredibly violent that is used against gender-critical feminists and gender-critical women. And I've argued before that there are elements of the transgender movement that look like misogyny in drag. It presents itself as a progressive movement, but actually it's pushing a misogynistic agenda that is directly harming women's freedoms and women's rights. All of us, I'm sure, support the right of trans people to live freely and without discrimination and to have the same rights as everyone else in society. What we're talking about here is the transgender movement, which I don't think is representative of most trans people. And that movement is saying some very problematic things and behaving in a frequently despicable way. And I'm on the side of women who want to organise and speak freely.
We'll have to leave it there. Brendan O'Neill, Katy John Went and Peter Tatchell, thank you very much for your time today. In response to that report, the Gender Identity Development Service spokeswoman said that the Tavistock and Portman NHS Foundation Trust welcomes the focus of Dr Cass and her team on increasing and broadening the care and support available for this group of patients who are currently waiting far too long and on developing the evidence base. We will work with her and NHS England to support her recommendations.